Indianapolis. I grew up here in Indiana. 24 years. It'll be 25 years this December that I actually sell direct sales. And here's the funny thing. I didn't know anything about the industry. I didn't know anything about business. It was actually my girlfriend's parents that introduced me to the industry. So I come back from school, and we were supposed to be doing homework, but we were watching TV, and I remember we went, we grabbed food, we sat down on the couch, and it was probably like a Wednesday or Thursday. I don't remember what day it was exactly. It was the middle of the week, and her parents come home, and her mom instantly goes into the garage and is rustling around and taking forever, and she comes out, and there's literally 30 brown paper bags. I can see out of the corner of my eye, the kitchen, and she lines up 30 brown paper bags, and they're all numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down, 30 of them. Well, my mom's a school teacher, so I had seen, things put together for classes and stuff, and I'm like, okay, that's weird, but I didn't think anything of it because I thought it was for school. Well, about 15, 20 minutes later, the doorbell rings, and a couple comes to the door, and she grabs a bag, and in this transaction, I don't really hear what's happening, and that happens. Well, about 10 minutes later, another person, and another person, and another person. And I don't know what neighborhood you grew up in, but my mind starts going, I'm like, so they have brown bags and people are coming to pick them up. Well, I wasn't really concerned until I walked in the next room. Her dad had come home, and he's literally sitting at the kitchen table with this pile of checks and cash and accounting. And I'm like, I don't know what neighborhood you come from, but it looks kind of weird, right? I'm like, okay, now I went from school to I'm concerned. So my next fear is I actually asked my girlfriend, I said, what exactly is your dad, what do your parents do? She's like, well, they own a business, but they really don't want me to tell you about it. So now I'm really scared. I'm like, okay, this is gonna, I'm gonna make episode of Cops, the news. So I wait till the end, and they're done at almost 9 o'clock. So I walk into the next room, and I'm like, guys, what are you guys doing? And her dad's like, oh, let me show you. And he gets up and walks towards the garage. So I'm thinking, oh boy, he's gonna open the door. There's gonna be lights and plants or a chemistry set or something. That was my fear, because my friends were kind of out there. And I'm like, it just didn't make sense, because her dad was a high engineer, he was over the engineering department for the company he was at. Mom's a speech pathologist. And I'm like, it just doesn't make sense that they'd be involved in something they shouldn't be involved in. So they open the door, and on the shelf, there's these shelves, and they're like, well, we're distributors for a company. And I was like, oh, okay, well, how does that work? It was more curiosity than anything. I was like, how does that work? And she goes on, he basically sits down, and that's when he first drew out direct sales and network marketing. And by the time he was done, he drew it out to their comp plan at that time, that company. The comp plan went to 100,000. Well, I don't know why, but I'm kind of got that builder mind. So I'm looking at the comp plan and the number of people, and I'm like, so if you built this 10 times larger, you could make $1 million doing this. And he's like, yeah, and I'm 17. I'm like, you could make $1 million doing this? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, are there people who've made $1 million doing this? He's like, yeah. I'm like, are there people who made $1 million in Indiana who have done this? And he's like, yeah. So basically what I was doing is I was kind of narrowing it down so I knew who to go talk to, because I was done talking with, I was like, where are you guys that know? But we know the people. I was like, well, where are they at? Well, when we go, because I had been dating their daughter for a while, he's like, well, when we leave on Monday and we go to that meeting? I'm like, yeah. He's like, that's where we're going. I'm like, cool. I invited myself. I said, well, can I go? And he said, yeah, I guess you can. The problem was when I went, the experience is probably very similar. I went, everybody in the room was 15 to 20 years old. So I come into the room and I sit in the very back, and I have jeans and a t-shirt and a leather jacket on, and this back here, let me go back far enough, is what I look like. That was actually my senior picture. So that's how I came in the room. So if you want to know where you can go, or how far you can go, that's kind of how I started out. Now, the interesting thing is this look got me some attention. It was just the wrong attention. I actually got arrested in front of my dad's house during Christmas, because I actually walked outside, and I was just kind of walking around just outside because I was pissed about something I don't remember. And because I looked suspicious, I looked the part of somebody suspicious, the police were called by the neighbors thinking that I was casing the house. And that was my stepmom and dad. I didn't live there full time, so nobody knew me. So I kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt. The police came up and they're like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I live here. And they're like, can you prove that? I was like, well, if you want to go inside, I'll show you the pictures on the wall. But they knocked on the door. My dad's like, yeah, my dad actually said to me, he's like, The good news is you're getting attention. The bad news is it's the wrong type of attention. You know, and I was like, okay, that's good to know. So from that point, what I did is I started learning. And I went to that first meeting, and I'll never forget the very first thing that they actually went through and taught was something called the cash flow quadrant. Does anybody know what that is? Robert Kiyosaki, the cash flow quadrant. And I had never heard this before. I had always heard you work basically dollar per hour, right? So I don't know what is a good, you know, and this is what he asked. He's like, what's a good hourly per hour? And I'm like, you know, I had my idea of what that was when I was 17, right? Now, this is going to be funny. Nobody has to say their age, but I want to show you something that's going to be relative later in what I'm talking about. But what was minimum wage when you started working? Rich, what was minimum wage when you started working? Do you remember?
You know, I think I had a job when I was about 13. But before that, I'd always done my own thing. I cut grass when I was,
Right.
before I even touched the top bar.
Right.
So I remember one of the issues was, like, they weren't paying me enough.
Right.
You know, and
you knew that at 13.
Yeah, and the only reason I remember taking that job, and this was the truth, you know, that I know I'm working hard every day after school. I mean, I'm kind of, you know, figured out how to get out of school to work, and everybody keeps asking me, when are you going to get a real job? So I thought, well, I guess that's what I got to do to get everybody off my back. You know?
Yep.
And it happened to be a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I knew the guy that owned it, his parents owned it, because they had a little go-kart shop on the corner next to it. And I got to know him a little bit.
Right.
And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go here, I'll impress him, because it doesn't seem to matter what I'm doing, even though I'm the only one on the block that actually has money to go to the party store and buy the ice cream and all that good stuff. I wasn't getting any respect. You know, it seemed like it. So,
Do you remember what the dollar amount was?
Oh, you know, I think it was like $5.35 or something like that.
Okay, that was more than me.
I know, I remember, I couldn't work there because I couldn't, this place was dirty, I mean, just.
Right.
Yeah, so, but I remember saying, you know, this is crazy, I can make this much in a day.
Right.
So,
Beth,
so,
do you remember what minimum wage? First one?
I did the same. It was
Okay.
a couple dollars, and there's probably 16 or something like that for neighbors.
Okay. Terry?
I know I babysat it for like $2.50 an hour.
Right.
Thinking I need to make a lot more money because these kids are just unruly.
Right. Try it
But
now, right?
they're,
Yeah,
$25
now
an hour now.
Right. Scott?
I worked at a grocery store when I was 16. I think I made like $4.10 an hour.
410, okay.
That was 5 1/4.
5 1/4, okay. I remember when I started, I think the first one was $4.75. Brandy?
$7.25.
Yeah, she's a lot younger.
So, the point was, if you look at this, you know, this is starting out. And this is all I knew was you were supposed to make more per hour, but nobody had really described to me what was good, what was bad. So what I started learning was, as I started putting the numbers down after I saw this, is that if you make about $10 an hour and you work, you know, this is working 40 hours a week, you make about $20,000 a year. But if you make about $15 an hour, you make about $25,000 a year, right? Or is it 30? It's 30. 30. About 30,000. If you get to $20 an hour, you make about 40. You get to 25, you get to about 50. $30 an hour is about 60,000. 35 is about 70. $40 an hour is about 80,000. And if you can get all the way to $50 an hour, you're at about 100 grand. Now the interesting thing is if you get to $100 an hour, you can make about 200,000. And if you get all the way to $500 an hour, you can make $1 million. So this was the only way that I knew to make money. So I was like, okay, but nobody ever described to me what anything really looked like. The reason I didn't know what it looked like is I had no idea really what anything cost. You know, I was thinking, well, I'll just move out, but I didn't realize the choices that you'd have. So what they did is they described to me this cash flow quadrant, and they did it a little bit differently. Robert Kiyosaki does it by the E quadrant, or the employee, and he said employees basically trade time for money. And you said the problem is there's a limited amount of what? Time. Is there any limit to the amount of money?
No.
Why?
Government keeps printing it.
We keep printing it. That's the thing. We keep printing it. So if we needed more, guess what we could do? We could print it. If the market demanded it, you could print more. You could create more. Now what's really crazy is you could run out of natural resources, right, to be able to print. So what they've done is now they've gone to digital currency, and are we ever going to run out of that? No, that's absolutely not even something you can touch, which is really cool too. But in the end, what I learned by Robert Kiyosaki said, the problem with this is there's a limited amount of money, and he's like, basically it takes you going to work every day. And if you don't go to work, what happens?
Don't get paid.
You don't get paid. So what ends up happening is these people get sold this idea. They look for security and benefits. This is what everybody talks about. Oh, I got a great job. It has tons of security. I'm going to be there forever and has great benefits. Does anybody else know of another place that has unbelievable security and great benefits? Like everything's covered. There's two places. Anybody know? The military and jail.
I was gonna say jail.
Now, the interesting thing about the military and jail is what actually happens is all of your freedoms are taken. So the closer you are to security and benefits, usually the farther you are away from freedom. I thought that was really interesting. So I started relating, and I was like, oh yeah, that sounds just like that job I had, you know, where you had to show up at this time, and if you didn't do this, and you know, if you went to the restroom, they were tracking that, and you couldn't, you know, screw around, and you couldn't have any of your own ideas. But here's the thing, about 80% of people, what? They end up as an employee. About 15% end up self-employed, and we're just gonna call that the S quadrant. And again, it takes you doing it, but here's the difference. You're trading time, but usually for a lot more money. So typically, to go self-employed, you have to create what? You have to have some kind of skill. Now, based on how difficult the skill is how much you can charge, what the market demands, right? If the skill is very, 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 very complicated, brain surgeon, you can make a ton per hour, right? If the skill is kind of basic, where, you know, it doesn't take an enormous amount, how many people know that just about anybody physically capable can mow grass, right? You know, so then it becomes how much are you doing it and how hard are you willing to work. You could lower the cost, right? And you could get more jobs, but then what's gonna happen? You're gonna run out of time. If you increase the cost, then what can happen? Somebody else can come in and undercut you. So you have to play that market game, right? It just depends on the market you're in, but if you live in the middle of nowhere, it's very hard to take off in the grass business. Why? Because people are like, you know what? A sheep is cheaper. You know, we can get a whole field of goats and we can eliminate this problem. We'll just change where they, you know, where they feed and grass is cut. About 15% total, but here's another interesting thing. These people look for what? They look for a way to do it themselves. Basically, I want to be my own boss. But again, what's the problem? If you don't go in, you don't make any money. So then you get this quadrant, the B quadrant. The B quadrant's really interesting. It's a business. Now, there's two definitions. Robert Kiyosaki said a big business is anytime you have 500 employees. The Small Business Administration says anytime you have more than 99 employees, regardless of how much you make. But the idea is if you had enough people contributing to your income, would you have to go to work? No. If you had enough people contributing to your income, you wouldn't have to go in at all. So, like, when I was sitting in the meeting at 17 and I heard that, I was like, okay, how does that work? Because that had never been taught. Now, I'll show you in a minute why it was never taught. But when I learned that, I was like, okay, that's what I want to do because that seems better. Then they dropped this on me. They said these people look for profit and systems. And if you don't have the proper the profit margin, and if you don't have the system set up, what the system does is it allows you to replace yourself. If there is no system, what happens? Chaos. Because Scott does it his way, Terry does it her way, Bess does it their way. So what this takes is somebody has to create this. And if somebody doesn't create that system, it never builds big enough for you to walk away. That's the biggest issue. That's the largest issue of an entrepreneur, is the system. 4% of the population of the United States. I population, or the I, is the investor. The investor is 1%. Now this really made me mad. They're like, do you know that there's investors that have enough money that they can actually invest in something, and the ROI, return on investment, this amount that comes off of them investing is actually more money than this, and this combined. And I was like, huh? They're like, yeah, this person can make more money than the other 3 people combined can do if the numbers are right. And I was like, okay, how do you get here? And they're like, typically the people who get there do not come from this category. And I was like, yeah. They said, if it worked, wouldn't we see more of them, right? How many people have met a lot of people who just have enough money that they just live off of their investments only? Has anybody met a lot of people like that?
No.
Are there a lot of people like that? There's a good number, but you usually don't see them at Walmart at the same time you go, right?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, they're not exactly in your.
She can help you sign in. There's a book in the back. Great to have you. Oh, Bess is gonna help you. I'm sorry. So, the ROI, this is the 1%. So I was like, I wanna get here. Like, I don't know how to get there, but I wanna get there. And I was like, if we can get there, guess what we could do? We could do whatever we want. But he said most of the people don't end up there because they actually don't have that either. They haven't gone self-employed. They haven't gone out on their own to learn how to learn the lessons to be able to make enough money. And he said, typically it's these people over here that figure out how to do this if they do what? If they create the system right. And I was like, well, that kind of upset me. And I was like, okay, how do you do this? So here I am, 17, sitting in the meeting, and they describe it, and they actually show me a business where I can actually go out and basically recruit and build these teams. Now, for those of you who don't know, direct sales has about 5 different compensation plans. So I can't talk directly compensation plan because everybody has a different one. But basically what they did is they started showing these numbers of, you know, this certain number of people that you brought in, and eventually they got to this number that was about 79 people. And then they said, what happens if each team eventually has 100 people on, you know, and they showed this number of basically 6 figures. And I thought, well, if you added a 0 to all these, and you had 1,000 people, that's only 6,000 people. Now, for some reason, I happen to remember, how many people are there in the United States?
About 350 million.
About 350, right? Now, 27% of them are underneath the age of 18. And there's a percentage that aren't working, but there's about 200 million working people. So I just thought, like when they showed me that, of every miserable person that I had ever talked to, and every conversation that I ever had of somebody who didn't work, I was like, I only need a handful of people who can go do that. I was like, I can find a handful of people. Like even at 17, I knew that. Here's the problem. What did I look like? Did I have any of the skills or attractiveness? By the way, for those of you who are just joining us, this is really funny. I'm gonna go back here so you guys can get a good view.
Thank you.
This is choice. I'm going back.
Oh, there.
So that's what I looked like when I started. When I was 17. Yeah, I got arrested out in front of my parents' house when I was 17 because I looked suspicious, like I was gonna case and break in. And I actually had to prove to the police that I lived there and knock on the door, and my dad came out and was like, yeah, we know it. Then I
He's
went in
lying.
and got reprimanded for what I looked like. So, I saw direct sales and I thought, wow, this is something I could do. So then, of course, I started asking all the questions. Do you need a degree to do this? And they're like, no. And I was like, hold up. I was like, I have been taught that you only succeed if you go to school. Guess what? My mom's a school teacher and my dad's a college professor. What do you think they taught me? Wow. Go to school. I was like, they told me not only go to school, but that was the only way you could make it. Now, kind of ironically, my dad's an artist, so he kind of has the job and is self-employed at the same time because he uses the products that his company makes to make art and makes money off of that. So I had kind of seen that model a little bit, the whole S quadrant, and I was like, wow, so you could actually do this and really get to a point where you could do both. So in my mind, I'm thinking, hey, my dad does both, I can do both. The problem is then they started introducing me to people who had done this, and instead of having 6,000 people on their team, I met a couple guys, one of them had 60,000 people on their team. Guess what the income was? It was much, much greater. Then I met another guy that when I met him, he had 600,000 people on his team. Guess what he made? It was more. Then I finally met the guy who had sponsored that guy, and he at that point, I think he had 1.5 million people on his team. So this guy had income coming in, and it was about, I want to say it was like every 31 seconds somewhere in the world somebody joined his team. That was pretty good. This guy that I first learned from, he's actually listed in the top earners right now of all time in the industry, and this was his profit from his company, his personal income that he's made from his company, $450 million.
Wow.
The next person down is like 100 million, and they've been in for 30 years as well. So he joined the business in 1964. So that was a while ago, right? Do you want to close that because it's just loud enough where it's going to come through? I don't want anybody distracted. And if you're not smart enough to find the room, it's going to be difficult, right, to build a business. Okay, so my point is not that you have to make 450 million, but my point is obviously there's enough in between. If I met people at 6,000 and I met somebody who has 60,000 and somebody has 600,000, what I learned was these guys had hundreds, and in some cases this guy had thousands of people on his team that made over 6 figures. And I was like, well, if there's thousands of people, then what I did is I started looking for somebody who was messed up as me that could do this. And it took me a while to find that guy, but that guy happened to reside on this guy's team. And I finally heard, and I came to an event where I was like, I finally met somebody who had all the challenges, in some cases more challenges than me, had less connections, had less things going for him, and he figured out how to build it. And what that did is that was my first huge breakthrough inside of the industry, that if that person could do it, I could do it. The problem was I also learned that it took him 10 years to figure it out. And that kind of upset me because I was like, man, I want it to happen faster than that. So that was kind of my journey into learning about the industry. But here's what I can tell you why it's so hard to build one of these companies. And the biggest reason why, and there's 10 things that I'm going to go over throughout this weekend, but the first one is, it's called your programming. We mentioned earlier that most of us had never heard about the 4 ways to make money, the Robert Kiyosaki cash flow quadrant. Most of us had never heard that before, and the reason we had never heard that before is because the system actually isn't set up to teach it. Here's the reason. Prior to 1900, guess how many people were self-employed in America prior to 1900?
100%.
95%.
Yeah, it was a lot. It was almost everybody. Other than some people worked for farming, there was very few people. And then manufacturing came along. And when manufacturing came along in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, around early 1900, there was this guy, Andrew Carnegie. Anybody know who he is?
Mhm.
And the steel industry started. Ford created what?
Cars.
But he also created the assembly line. And when they created the assembly line, eventually what these guys did is they all met several times, but one of the things they did is they discussed where things were going, and they brought in these consultants. They said, we have a problem. And they gave this number to them, 20. They said, this is the problem. In 20 years, everybody who works in your factory is either going to be dead or retired. And if you guys plan on keep growing at the rate you're growing, how fast was manufacturing and things growing at the turn of the century? Amazing. Like, everything was changing. So, like, we have to convince 95% of the population that they need to stop doing what? Working for themselves and start working. It'd be better to work for who? Us. Well, this is interesting. This is where money gets involved in education. So what they did is they created 2 things. The common school and the normal school. I thought, when I first heard this, I thought they were kidding, and then I went and Googled it, so I would suggest everybody to Google it. They actually created the common school and the normal school. One of them taught teachers, and one of them taught students. Who did they teach first?
Teachers.
They taught the teachers first on how to be what? How to be normal, and then they created the common school. In the common school, everybody dressed what?
Same.
The same. All the desks were lined up in what? In a line. And everything was done in an orderly fashion, just like the assembly line. And what they started talking about was, well, if you go to our school, instead of working on the assembly line, you can do what? Well, you could manage the people on the assembly line. Now, if you do really well, you could manage a couple assembly lines. So if you do really well in school, you can manage a couple assembly lines. If you do really, really well, you could manage the people that manage the people who manage the assembly lines. Now, if you're working in a field, does that sound a little bit better? Yeah. And what they promised was security. And it wasn't going really well until 1929. What happened?
Stock market
The
crash.
The stock market crashed. Ironically, the same people here that wanted this to happen basically went and created this. The Fed. Does anyone know what the Fed is?
Reserve, Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve. There's a couple of interesting things. The Federal Reserve Bank. There's a couple things. It's not federal. There's no reserves, and it's not a bank. I was like, what? It's a private entity. It's a private company. And guess what it does? It runs the entire monetary system of the United States. The entire monetary system is ran by that entity. All of the interest rates, everything is governed by that entity, and it's a private institution. All of a sudden, everybody loses everything. Now what they say is, wow, look, those guys lost everything, those guys lost everything, those guys lost everything. But if you go to our school, take our classes, we could get you a job where you'd always have money. No up and down, no bad months. You'd have security. We'll put these rules and laws in place where the banking system can never fall apart again. But watch this. You're going to work in our factory, right? The factory. You're going to go to our school, and eventually you're going to live in our houses across the street, and you're going to buy from our marketplace. Guess where the money was going? Back in to those guys' pockets. Smart, right? But guess what they stopped teaching?
Independence.
Employee, self-employed, business, investor. They started teaching this. And every conversation came along. And eventually you heard something like this. You heard, well, if you go to school and get good grades, you can go to a good college and get a good degree, which means you can get a good job and you can make good money. And what are you supposed to do with that money? You're supposed to save it, invest it. Guess who owns the banks in this situation? Guess who owns the investments in this situation? They do. And everything will work out. How well has it worked out? Has it been working out for a lot of people for a long time? This hasn't worked for a long time. Now the question is who did you hear this from? Who did you hear it from?
Parents.
I heard it from my parents. So I asked my mom, I said, well, where did you hear it from? Well, your grandparents used to talk about this all the time. I was lucky enough to talk to my grandparents before, and they said, well, it's actually our parents told us this. My grandmother was basically born during the Great Depression. She goes, I remember my mother, your great-grandmother, talked about this all the time. This is what she talked about. They talked about losing everything. She remembered not having anything. And to the day my grandmother could no longer do it, every time we walked through a hotel or an airport or anything, she would go and check all the change for the telephones. This is way back, right? Payphones. And she'd come, and every time we met her, she'd be like, I found $3 or $4 or whatever. I mean, she always found money. But everything was about saving everything. You know, didn't throw anything away. Every single whipped cream container from 1964 to whatever, when we cleaned out her, like, we had all of them. Does anybody remember this? Okay, some other people are shaking their head, yes. Like I'm hitting some chords.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So when I learned this programming, I was like, you know what? We were never taught to build a team. We were actually trained not to do it. So all the skills that it takes to build a team, do you think those were taught at school?
No.
No.
Why? Because the reality is, do the people who set that system up want competition? I'm going to leave it on one more note before we kind of move on to the last thing. The last thing that group of people, that specific group of people did before they passed away is they started a couple other things other than the Fed. Guess what the other one was? They wanted, here's what they said, we want to put our money in something that's going to support our families for the next 300 years. That's kind of a cool trip, right? I mean, if you're thinking big, how do you put your money somewhere where you know for a fact you're going to be good for the next 300 years?
Insurance?
AMS. Anybody, can anybody guess it?
American Mortgage something?
American Medical Society. It was the Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie. It was those guys who put the money who actually funded the American Medical Society. And they went after and they attacked natural health. And they did a campaign for 25 years. It was actually that institution that created this word. A quack. What is a quack? What is it? Has anybody heard it?
Someone who, doctor.
Well, a
Like
quack is somebody who
Doesn't know what they're talking about.
is incompetent.
Yeah.
Right.
So what they did is they put all their money that science and the creation of the medical industry was where their money would be, and it would basically rule society for the next 300 years.
And they've been destroying our health.
And it worked so well, the FDA actually is the most powerful entity underneath the FED. It actually has more jurisdiction and more power than the FBI, CIA, any of them. Isn't that crazy? Like the more you read into it and the more you learn, you're like, okay. So when I started learning this, you're basically being programmed on what to believe and what's good for you and what's not good for you. But the interesting thing is now that we have the internet and we started learning things from other places, you start learning that some of these lessons we've been taught aren't necessarily accurate. It's really not so much to educate you, but to control you and tell you what you should do, so that way the money flows up the chain to the right people. So what I wanted to do is I had to start reprogramming myself, which was difficult. So what I had to do is I had to read stuff that wasn't popular, that wasn't common. And one of the biggest things in the book, Think and Grow Rich, that they talk about is the number one group of people that will stop you from succeeding are who? Friends, family, and
Yourself.
and yourself. Yourself is number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I realized is the first person I had to reprogram was me. And I was like, man, I got a lot of work to do. Now, here's what ended up happening kind of in my story, so I'm going to jump back a little bit, is I got involved in that business, and I started going to events like this. And the first event, at the beginning of the year, I remember this, Free Enterprise. This was the very first event. It was a January event, and we went to Atlanta, and there were about 60 or 65,000 people at that event. This is a big event. And what it was a combination of some of these big networkers all came together. One big part of the organization all came together. It wasn't everybody. It was just that guy's organization came together. And And they brought in speaker after speaker after speaker. They kind of told stories like this. So like, you know, here's where I was. I didn't have any contacts. When I was 17, did I have any business contacts? No. No, I really didn't know anybody that did anything significant other than my parents and my parents' friends and my friends' friends, who were all complaining about what? Money, time, working hard. Do you think I had any business skills?
No.
No, I didn't have any business skills. Did I know anything about leadership or team building? No, not even a clue. So I had no business contacts, I had no skills. Do you think I had any money? So I had no money to influence anybody, didn't have a cell phone that didn't exist, didn't have a car, so I couldn't take anybody anywhere. So I just basically had to go where the people were. So I'm like, okay, I'll go to Atlanta, and I listened to person after person after person talk, and I started meeting kind of remarkable people. I remember one of the first people that came out and spoke was Rudy Rudiger. Does anybody know the movie Rudy?
Yes.
Okay. Finally got to meet him, which was kind of nice. Got to see him speak a couple times. But he basically told this story about how he wanted to do this so bad, and it took him years to do it. Well, what's interesting is it actually took him longer to create the movie than it did to play football, which, I mean, you'd think to be a Notre Dame football player when you're like 5'5" would be hard enough. It was actually harder for him. So here he is down in Florida working lawn jobs, telling his story, saying, hey, I'm going to make this movie, I'm going to make this movie. Everybody that he was mowing lawns with it told him what? You're nuts. It's never going to happen. You're crazy. Now the guy's a motivational speaker. Not where you'd think you'd go, right? You'd go from working your butt off to play football to then spending almost 20 years, you know, sweating in the sun, mowing, telling people this dream that you're going to have, and now he's a motivational speaker. So when I learned that, I was like, wow, he did it. What I wasn't factoring in was how long it was going to take to do it, right? So I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. So I heard person after person, and then that spring, we went to something called leadership. Now, obviously, my mom's a school teacher, and my dad is a college professor, and none of them taught me how to write or English. I'm bad at both of them, so if you're wondering why my skills are so bad, as I didn't listen to my parents like most of us didn't, like most kids don't. So that's why it's terrible. If there's misspellings up here and stuff, I wrote all this, I did all this, so forgive me now. But please point it out to me, because I would like to fix it, because there was something in a PowerPoint that we were using in a big team of people, like 50,000 people, that I wrote, and it was all over the place. It was done every week, and it was like 2 years after I stopped with them that we went back and philosophy had been spelled wrong. I spelled it wrong. It does have more letters than I thought. So leadership was the next event I went to, and what I did is I started meeting these remarkable leaders. It was the first time I heard John Maxwell's name mentioned from stage. You know, somebody got up and started talking about John Maxwell at this leadership event, and I was like, I listened to it and I was like, man, that sounds really cool, but like, where does that come from? Like, I had no reference point, right? Because what do you think the leadership was with a group of people that looked like that? Wasn't good, I'll put it that way. I went into competitive fighting, that's the only thing. So when I got mad and I couldn't figure something out, I figured if I punch you, that would solve it. So that was the way I was handling everything when I was 17 and on. Not a great way to deal with stuff. It led me to a lot of problems. And then there was something, they called it something different. It was called Family Reunion, but it was basically this team building event. And what I did is I learned person after person came onto stage and they talked about these teams that they were able to build all over the country, and I was like, wow, that's kind of amazing. And then it finished with, hold on, this is, I think, Bess, can you go grab Mr. Kelly? He's out in the hall. You'll probably see him, that's all I know. Team building event. And then next was something called Dream Weekend, but it was kind of an achievement seminar. It was all about achievement. There he is. And what I did is I went to all 4 of these in a year. This was Atlanta, this was Tennessee. The team building event was in Florida. Does anybody know the Fontainebleau Hotel? Does anybody know of the Fontainebleau Hotel? If you look up the old mafia movies, a lot of the old mafia movies were all shot in the Fontainebleau. A lot of the Rat Pack was all shot there. It was a really, really cool, very expensive. Supposedly the hotel was actually built with mafia money, and it's unbelievably ornate and expensive. Still exists today. It's like all like marble floors. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. So I went there for this team building event. And then Dream Weekend, I think we were in Cincinnati or Louisville. watch this, in 1 year, I traveled more and met more people and heard more success than I had in my entire life. So from here, the next year was kind of the same. The next year was the same. By the time I was done in that company 4 years later, by the time I was 20 and I got sick, I was kind of telling them, when I was 20, I not only got married, but I found out I had cancer that year. So I went to the hospital for about a year. Went from a 160-pound athlete, I was a track runner, ran the 100, 200, and went to 106 pounds in like 90 days, which is an awesome weight loss program, but I don't recommend it to anybody. It took about a year to recover from that. My passport, actually, I was kind of saying that's how I came across it. I was like, oh, I need to renew my passport. My passport was actually 6 months after I got out of the hospital, and I was 120 pounds. And I had a shaved head, of course, at that point, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have a choice. And I actually got held up the last time we were kind of coming back through Brazil. What's up, man? All right. Actually, when I was coming back through Brazil, or going to Brazil, I got stopped and they didn't believe it was me, and then I had to prove that. And I was like, look, I really have, and I had to show them the scar. And oh. So this is what I learned. So we have programming, right? And your programming leads into your philosophy. Did I spell it right? Okay. I forgot the other T, I think, in philosophy when we spelled it on a national PowerPoint that went all over the country that everybody was using. And it was out for years, and then 2 years later I was editing it and I was like, philosophy spelled wrong. Nobody caught it, which was really interesting. So either somebody was really good at speaking or nobody was paying attention, which, you know, if you do a lot of trainings, both are true, right? So philosophy. So kind of there are two philosophies, right? There's a philosophy of, you know, the glass half full, and there's a philosophy of the glass half empty, right? So this is where positive and negative comes from. If you grew up in the employee setting, basically spending all your time chasing money, how do you think you see things philosophy-wise?
I don't know.
Half empty.
Yeah, scarcity mindset.
Exactly what it was. There's not enough. I can't make it. So what happened was is I started looking at this chart. And I started looking at the things I wanted in life. And this teaches a lot. I actually started doing this with people who are graduating high school. It was the first time I drew it out. I always thought like this, but I drew it out for somebody and somebody's like, oh my gosh, you need to totally show that every time you talk. I was like, okay, I will. So what I did is I was like, you know, when I first started out and I was thinking $8, $10 an hour, you know, the one thing is just where you live. At $10 an hour, where do you live? At $10 an hour, probably where are you living?
In your parents' home.
At home or family, right? It's usually family. And you might not even have a room. You might be on a couch or in a basement or in a closet, you know, Harry Potter style. That's just kind of life. Now, when you look at car, if you make $10 an hour, what kind of car do you have? Maybe none. You might be traveling Uber, but if you do have a car, it's probably a family hand-me-down. There's 3 different wheels, 3 different hubcaps, 2 different door colors. You know, that was like one of my first cars. One of my first cars, you could actually see through the floor, like it had rusted through, like that actual interior had been ripped out, and you could see the ground moving, so you could Flintstone it if you wanted to. I did drop a couple things through before I like learned about littering and things. So the car was bad. It's bad or none, right? So if this is your life and this is your car, what kind of like lifestyle do you live? Like what kind of things do you do for fun if you make $10 an hour?
Eat pizza.
Pizza, Netflix. If it's free, it's probably good, right? If it's free, it's good. What kind of extras do you have the ability to buy in life?
None.
What kind of food do you probably eat? It's probably fast or cheap, right? Pizzas and Taco Bell and ramen noodles and ramen noodles with flavor.
Peanut butter and jelly.
Peanut butter and jelly, yeah.
I like peanut butter jelly.
Yeah. So, what kind of savings do you have?
0.
What kind of investments do you have?
0.
What kind of travel do you have? None.
To the mailbox.
Maybe. You're chasing constantly. So here's what's interesting. If you go from $10 an hour to $20 an hour, how do things change? What happens to your living situation? Now where can you live?
You have a choice.
Maybe an apartment, right? Maybe not a house, but you can probably get into an apartment. What happens to your car?
Upgrade.
You at least have one, right? You might have a payment on something, but it's older, right? In most cases, it may have some other issues, but it's nicer than the thing you had before, right?
You can afford gas.
You can afford gas, right? Which is always the case. If you get $10 an hour, you always ask for gas. The lifestyle you live, if it's free, now all of a sudden you can go to a movie and actually get $19 popcorn, right? Once in a while. But you can't take everybody. You're like, I'm not taking all of you. You're sneaking stuff in.
Absolutely.
Why do you have a parka on when it's summer? Well, because it's cold inside the movie theater, right? You're able to do some extras and have some extra stuff, but not really. What kind of savings do you have? Probably none.
Negative.
What kind of investment? Yeah, it's probably negative. Investments are negative. What kind of debt do you have?
A
Here
lot.
you're getting some debt if you have credit, because if you started out at $10 an hour, do you usually even get credit? No. You usually don't even get credit. If you do get credit and you have $10 an hour, what happens to it? It goes backwards. You can't pay, so you miss a payment on that before you miss a payment on the car and go out with your friends. People learn that the hard way, right? When you get to $40 an hour, what happens to your lifestyle? It goes up, right? So all of a sudden now you have a house. Now, when you put real numbers to this, and I don't have time to do it right now, but when you put real numbers to all this, it really starts changing, and you start seeing this perspective on what's happening. But as you move up, if you go from an apartment that's $800-900, and all of a sudden you go to a house payment that's $1,200 to $1,400, you know how they always get you for more. They're like, what do you qualify for? Well, the debt ratio says, and my DTI says that you'll qualify for $1,500. Well, I don't want to spend $1,500. I want $900, right? You want a $900 house. But then all of a sudden you see the $900 house, and you can walk in without opening the door, because there is no door, right? You've been in those neighborhoods. And you're like, well, it's a little breezy in the living room because it's missing windows. And I like the skylight that's not supposed to be there. So you're like, the $1,200 house looks a lot better, right? It has a backyard and it's fenced in. So all of a sudden you upgrade, and you've upgraded. Now what happens to the car? You upgrade, right? So now all of a sudden you went from the used Kia, Toyota, whatever, hand-me-down. Now all of a sudden you're almost looking, man, you could get the new Honda. You could get the new. Now you're probably not going luxury, although some people do, because they'll get in on the lowest level. They went from, right, there used to be like the 5 Series and the 7 Series and the 9 Series, right? Now all of a sudden there's a 3 Series. Now there's a 1 Series. What are they doing? They're lowering down to capture the market, right? Because they know we buy the name over anything. Lifestyle, travel, all the way down here. You might be traveling, but if you're traveling at 40, what are you probably doing? You're probably putting it on credit.
Campgrounds.
What?
Camping.
Camping, yeah, stuff like that. You get all the way out to $100 an hour. Now here's what's fun, or I'm sorry, yeah, it's double it. $80 an hour. If you're an $80 an hour, what do you make it? Over 100 a year? About 120? Because $50 an hour is 100. So you're a little over 125. Now I didn't even mention this, but what's happening to your tax bracket as you do this? It's going up. So you're actually working harder. How many more hours are you spending probably doing this? Probably takes more hours.
Double.
But you're also probably going into more debt because of the education you have to have in the job world to do this, right? Unless you have that awesome hookup friend deal, which sometimes happens. This is just how the job world works. And you get all the way to 80, and let's just call it 150. Here's what's funny. When I do this, watch this. This is really cool. Computer went out. When you do this, what ends up happening is, when I'm talking to kids, 18, when I'm talking to even adults, here's what they'll do. Somewhere between here and here, they're like, you can't make that. I can't make that. I don't have a degree. I can't do that because I have a prior record. I can't do that because I never went to that school. I'm not from that neighborhood. What's interesting is they will cut themselves off where their dream stops, where they believe it's possible. Their belief actually comes out when I'm talking about this. Oh, I can't. Why? Well, you know, I don't have a degree. I have I have some kind of record that keeps me from doing that. And I was like, so you can't, there's nobody that makes that money that doesn't have a degree? No, not likely. Not in their idea. Well, I had a felony because of this, that, and the other thing. I didn't, but the person I was talking to, they're like, I had a felony. There's no way you can make that kind of money. I was like, so you're telling me there's nobody who has a felony that makes that kind of money? They're like, well, I don't know. I said, well, do this for me. You have a phone in your hand? They're like, yeah. I'm like, I want you to Google something. Google earn 6 figures without a degree. I said, just Google it. I was reading it last night to, we were printing some stuff, and I was actually reading it to a girl who was working at FedEx, and she's like, I read her just the title. I said, oh yeah, I just faxed this. I said, people who don't have a degree who earn 6 figures. She goes, yeah, but all those jobs are, and she's sales, or I can't remember what she exactly said, and I was like, no. And I started reading off the jobs. She's like, yeah, but that one needs this, and that, well, that one doesn't need that. You could actually see it expanding. Like, wow, I didn't know you could do that. But you could tell her belief was pulling her back down to the income that what she believed she was worth. Self-worth. It was amazing. Another person says, but I can't do that, I have a felony. I said, why don't you Google this? People who make 6 figures who have felonies, what can you go into? And there was a list of like 33 different professions that you can go into.
Wow.
People get so limited. Why? Because we're taught. Are people easier to control when every single moment of their life they're chasing money? They're so much easier to control. So if we can keep people from making money, not we, but if the greater institution can keep people from making money, then that's a good situation for them because it's easier to control people. It's easier to sway people when they need the money, when they need the handout. All of a sudden, if you have your own money, you can do whatever, right? Not that that's a good thing always. I'm not saying that, but it's some people abuse that, but it does make sense.
When they don't have money.
So
They're chasing money.
what I had to do philosophy-wise is I had to start hanging out with it. I really started having to reprogram some of what had been programmed because I had this glass half full kind of mentality to everything. So when I saw network marketing, here's what I started doing. I was going to the meetings and I was like, man, I don't know if I can do this because that guy has a degree. I don't know if I can do this because that guy has. The people that I was looking at that were standing up in the front of the room were big time people. There was a medical doctor that not only was a doctor, but he was a hospital administrator, so he was over 3 hospitals and was a minister. The other guy was an attorney and a doctor, so he went to medical school first, but also wanted to do law because one of his parents was a lawyer, so he did both. Then there was a dentist there, then there was a construction person who had this giant construction company. But the one thing that kept ringing in the back of my head, I was like, well, all these people went to school and had money, and they did what my parents told me to do, and they did that, and they're all trying to get out. I was like, they're all trying to run away, and they kept talking about, yeah, we make decent money, but our time, we have no time, we don't get to see our kids, there's things that we don't get to do. And I'm just looking up to make sure we're on time, and I have my notes here, really quick. So philosophy was, I had a glass half empty mentality. How do you think that affected my business? Huge, because guess who I wanted to go talk to? Guess who I attracted? People whose glasses were half empty. So I had a lot of conversations with people who didn't believe that they were worthy of the business. Not that it wouldn't work. Most of the time when somebody says, I don't have the time or I don't have this, what happens is when we don't believe something, we create an excuse immediately, right? We create an excuse immediately. So a lot of times they're not saying, I can't do it or it's not possible. They just don't believe it's possible for them. So what I started doing is I started using my skill to basically, a good way to say it is trick, manipulate the situation to create belief. What I started doing, now this is bad, this is real bad, but what I did is I went out and I started presenting, and I would scan the room and I'd have conversations, and eventually it would get to that point where I'd find out who was the #1 person in the room. I'm just going to use Mr. Kelly because he's right here in front of me. And I would find out Mr. Kelly was the #1 person, and I'd develop a relationship, and what I would do is I would find out what was his work ethic like. I would find out how many people he was actually presenting to, and I would, in the business that I I started in, to come in the room ahead of time, to be in the leadership, you didn't have to say you were doing something. You had to prove it. You had to show the numbers. You had to show the numbers in your notebook with the number of people you had talked to and with the results. No guessing. Well, how many nights a week were you out doing the business and how many you were tracking? You couldn't get in that room unless you had presented to 15 people in 30 days. Couldn't even get in the room. And then what they did is they sectioned it out by the people who were really doing it. Eventually, that group was cut out and you had to do 20 because it just, the room filled up. What they did is they kept raising the bar, and guess what the organization did? It exploded. So what I did is I found out what they were doing, and I started tracking, and what I did is I would show 1, and then I show 2, and then I show 3, and 4, and 5, 6, and 7, and I realized that people were scared to get in. So what I did is when this guy told me, I'd do it, but I really, he was honest at least. It was like, man, I just don't think that I'd be able to get anybody. And I would eventually ask, I was like, is it really time, or do you just not think you'll be able to get anybody? Honestly, I tried this before, and I just don't think anybody will get in. Cool. I said, well, if I happen to find somebody who's, going to be a builder, someone who's really going to take off, I will hold your position in the line of people that I'm talking to, and if that person decides to get in, I will put them under you. I'll call you back and I'll let you know if it happens, because I know money's tight right now and it's not good right now. So what I did is I looked for just that little bit of belief, and then I went out and showed 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. And what I found is if I got to 15 or more, I would always find somebody that I didn't even finish the whole presentation, but they were ready. They're like, okay, yeah, I do this, yeah. So they start asking questions. So like, what does it take to get started? Have you ever heard that? Like, well, what exactly does it take to get started? Or how much is it? Do I have to have all that right now? What they're saying is I want to do it, but my checking account, like I don't know the exact amount of money that's in it right now. I want to do it right now, but I don't know if I have that amount of money right now. So I would just, well, is now better or next Friday? When do you get paid? So what I did is, instead of creating an environment where they have to tell me they don't have the money, I gave them the option to kind of save face. A lot of people don't get this, and what they'll do is be like, well, we want to sign up, because what happens is it becomes about us, and it becomes about our goals, and we're trying to make our money and our numbers, and it's not a bad thing to help them figure it out. But if it's all about you, I would start asking them. I was like, well, when do you get paid? Well, I get paid every 2 weeks, so I don't get paid till next week. Is next week better? Because I want to make sure that your kids are eating. I want to make sure that your house is paid. Like, this isn't about going in debt and making everything. Yes, I know we can make money in the first week, but I don't want to put that pressure on you or me. Because if there's a bunch of pressure going in and it doesn't work out, what happens? Not only did they quit, but how many people are they going to tell it didn't work?
Right.
Everybody. You pressured them in. But if it's cool and they get in when it makes sense and it works, now they're telling everybody it brings success. So it has to be more about them. I would find, let's say number 15, I get an application. I would come back to this person, but what's better is I would come back to this person and say, hey, I know I told you that if I found a big hitter, then I would put him on your team and I'd save your spot. I just want to let you know I found this big hitter. You have exactly whatever the deadline is to me. Because this person wants in. You have 12 hours. You have till tomorrow. Now, I've run in different companies that their week ends different, or maybe their month ends different. So if you happen to be like on a Saturday, for instance, because I know some people, Saturday is their day where the week ends and it facilitates. I would say, look, you have tomorrow. I don't want to put the pressure on you for midnight. I said, well, you have tomorrow by 9 o'clock. If it works out and you can come up with the money, great, I'll put you in. And I might just send him a text message. Like, if I don't really have the relationship, I just might send him a text message and say, hey, I want to let you know this person's getting in. If that person calls and starts asking questions, what do I automatically know? They're really interested, right? Mm-hmm. Now I want to spend a little bit more time building belief and figuring out, overcoming the objection. Then, let's say this person, like, no, I can't do it. No, I don't even hear from him. Don't hear from him. But 4 has the conversation, is like, you know what, I really think I'm going to do it. I said, well, I just want to let you know, not only would you get the builder that I got, but there could be, I'm going to go through the rest of the list, and there could be 9 other people that join. Okay, I'll do it. If I get in, see, people instinctively know if there's a bunch of people that are getting in, that they're going to be in a good situation. It's when they don't have anybody and they think they're going to have to create it all. And most people never see what? They never see somebody else go to work for them. It's always about you going to work for them. my best day, this application helped me create 8 others. And one day, personally recruited 9 people. And then I started teaching. I actually had to teach my upline how to do this at one point because he didn't know. And I said, you know, you're working so hard to get this one person, but you're missing the other 40 people you talk to. Here's how to go back the right way and introduce it to them and bring more people with you. So his best day, I actually have a video of this. His best day is he took one application and created 6 others. He got 7 people in at one time. And that's somebody who did not have the skill. Did not have the skill, didn't even understand, and fought me on it when I taught him to it initially. But he saw me do it so many times, month after month. So what I would do is, in a 30-day cycle, I said, look, this is why we're working. In a 30-day cycle, we're showing this 15, maybe 30, maybe if you're crazy, 45. If you're insane, you might show 60 people or more. If you show it to this many people, find out where they're at. If it's absolutely no, I hate you, get out of my house, I will shoot at your car. If you pull up with it, don't show up. You know, that's not a phone call I'm gonna have. But if it's kind of like, I don't have the money. How many people have ever heard this? I just don't have the money to get started right now.
Right.
Or I just, timing wise, I got too much going on. I'm going to school, I'm selling my house, I'm getting divorced, the dog, the cat, the kids. I mean, you know, stuff happens in people's lives. So you kind of have to gauge where they're at and what you can push and what you can't. And sometimes you don't know these people. Like I was talking to a lot of people I didn't know through leads. So I just had to feel them out, and this is where all the leadership stuff really comes in about team building, is finding out who people are, what their personality is, and what their motivation is. If you know the problem is once you know people's motivation, you know the personality, and you know where you can push, it gets really dangerous because you can do it all the time. But make sure you're doing it for their good and not always for your good. Does that make sense? 15, 30, 45. I said you're missing all these people. So what we do is we run the goal is the number of presentations you do, but the end result would come down by the end of the month is we take whoever we talk to and basically build the team and look for who that builder is that we can come in and basically take that application and go back and fish. So I tell this to people and it kind of upsets them. I worked really hard for 18 months. I was doing here, I was somewhere between here and 100, depending on the month in presentations, personal presentations. I just stuck there for about 18 months. And I started doing this and I started building. Now this is another philosophy thing. And I'm gonna pick on Mr. Kelly because we've had similar building situations. If you would have taken every single person you would have recruited in the first years that you built and put them in one leg, what would that leg look like today? Not only would it exist, it'd probably be a legacy kind of organization. If you took the second year and just built the second year, you didn't touch the first one, you just keep teaching it, but you just started your second year and you started recruiting, and you're just like, I'm going down, I'm not going anywhere else. I don't care, I didn't care what promotion corporate was offering, I didn't care to go on a cruise, I didn't care to show up in a room of people for an event. What I cared about was long-term, never having to work again. That was my goal. Spend the second year building straight down. And if you spent the third year, and I'm talking about when you were really building, 3 years, if you had 3 solid organizations in most companies, some are binary, so you only have to, you just go straight down, period. What if you just spent 1 year just making sure that that organization is done, and then you build a second organization that's a binary? Sometimes you need leadership and other things, but if you just spent all your time doing that, and everybody that you talked to knew, guys, I'm just building this one leg. So I'm starting today, it's January, every single person for the whole year goes on your team. Everybody I run into. You can either do it now, or I'm gonna come back, and I'll be in a different organization, but here's the thing, by the time I get over here, I'll have people call me. What happened was, is I did this, and by the time I was 18 months in, people were calling me, guess from where? From year 1 and 2 that I did this, and all of a sudden they saw, they're like, hey, we heard through somebody that thing worked, and and I could have gotten in. I mean, there were a couple people that were in the first 10 people I talked to that I didn't get a call from them until I was here. Now guess what? They wanted me to work just as hard here as I did here, but now I didn't have to. So I worked for 18 months, and then I worked really hard 4 days a month. Because that's all I had to do. I had done it for so long, all I did was I went back to my original notebooks, and I would just follow up with everybody. Hey, what are you doing now? Because what I found is every 6 months, people's entire life usually changes, right? You know, they weren't looking. They just got married. They just got divorced. They just bought a house. They just started the job. 6 months later, they're like, oh yeah, that job I thought was going to be cool, it ain't cool. That relationship that was horrible, that was completely distracting, I'm freed up now. Does this make sense? I really only worked hard for 18 months, but I did it with a plan, a real plan. And it took me 18 months to basically build an organization that paid me for the next 5 years. And it just so happened that we just kind of looked at it, and there's still 1,000 active people in that organization 7 years after I left it. I was like, wow, that worked. It not only worked, it worked without me. It worked when I left, it worked when I was like, I don't want to do it anymore. That would be kind of some solid income, right? Here's the number one thing that I've learned if you want to build this long term. So this was a little bit of my philosophy of how I built. Now you're thinking, and I'm just going to kind of shorten this because I'm going to bring up Mr. Kelly here in 2 minutes. It's your identity. Who are you? What I decided is I was a business builder. I'm not necessarily a networker. I'm not necessarily a product seller, right? But I build organizations. That's what I do. Because if you look at the whole system of business, you'll probably, if you run into me, you never hear me talk a lot about the product other than I've used them. That's not what I talk about. Why? Because that's not where the money is. It is. You have to move the product to make the money, but that's not where building the organization comes in. People aren't going to buy because the product is so usually amazing. Although you're going to get testimonials. The problem is when we go to rooms, like in business, what do we hear? We hear these stories of these testimonials and we think that's what's going to sell people in. When reality is, it's really opportunity that sells people in. It's really the opportunity for them to make money. That's what people are looking for. I'm not looking to spend another $20, $50, $80. I'm looking to make another $20, $50, $80, right? Okay? Okay. No, I'm kidding. So you have your program, you have your philosophy, you have your identity, and your identity comes into your thinking. The problem is in network marketing, you have short-term thinking and you have long-term thinking. Now watch this. We were talking about the glass half full and half empty. If you're half empty, what kind of thinking do you think you have, short-term or long-term? Short-term. So everything you do is for the dollar today instead of building something long-term for the legacy. So what I realized is my program was messed up to start out with. So all of a sudden I have this glass half empty mentality. My identity is I was a failure. Why was I a failure? I was a failure because I had long hair. I didn't look like everybody else. I was a failure because I didn't follow what everybody else was doing. I wanted to go into business. Everybody else was going to college to get a degree, to get a job. So I was a failure in everybody's mind. Then I looked at my thinking. Everything I was doing was short term. I wanted to have fun today. There was no delayed gratification. I wanted the computer, I went out and bought it, even though I was in debt, even though I didn't have the money, even though I probably couldn't make the payments, but I wanted it. Because I felt good for the moment, but then what was the reaction? So this is something that I learned about your thinking is, and motivation is, you have to think right, to act right, to feel right. But most people get themselves in trouble by doing this. They feel first, then they act, then they think about what happened, and we're like, crap, that didn't work out. How many people have ever done this before? You felt a certain way, you went on impulse, you did it, and you acted, and then all of a sudden you thought. A lot of people, they'll wait, and they'll wait, and they'll wait, and they'll wait, and then they'll go out and do a little bit of activity. Oh my gosh, it didn't work. Oh, I should have thought at the beginning of the month to start at the beginning of the month. I should have planned it out differently. Does it make sense? So my programming led into my philosophy led into my identity led into my thinking, and my thinking led into my attitude. Now attitude, this is where you're either positive or negative. Now think about this, if I had a glass half empty mentality, my identity was I was a failure, I was short-term thinking, what do you think, I was positive or negative in how I felt all the time?
Negative.
Do you think that was coming out in every conversation I was having with people? I wasn't so much negative as I was pissed off and upset. And when you're upset and you're angry, and I was a fighter by nature, so when people told me no, I didn't want to have a conversation, and I wanted to punch them hard. Why don't you get this? And I was abrasive. How many people are you going to recruit being abrasive? If you kick their dog, they do not want to get it. I never kicked a dog, but I'm just saying. But that's how I felt. I wanted to kick their door on the way out. I wanted to slam it. I never did, but that's how I felt all the time. So what I did is I had to come back to my programming, and that's, Jim Rohn talks about this, but it was so well drawn out when I kind of saw it this way, is you have to work harder on yourself than you do on anything else, because if you fix yourself, once I started fixing my programming and I started seeing, this is half full, money can be printed. There's no shortage, there's tons of it. My identity, I was able to fix my identity. I went from failure to I started looking at these business people who had succeeded. I was like, I really started thinking about it. I was like, well, there's some people in the NBA that I know that didn't have the right upbringing and they figured out a way out. There's people in the NFL, there's people in music that I was following that they figured a way out. But what I found was they started mastering the craft and they got away from everybody getting in trouble. They just focused on what they were doing. That's it. That's the only thing that they were doing. So I started learning mastery by taking all my effort, all my energy, and focusing on the craft and just getting really, really, really good at the craft. Every time I went to a meeting, what I would do is I said, what went bad and what went good, and I'm going to follow what went good, and I'm going to try to remove the rest of the stuff from what I'm doing. Now, I'm a person who failed English twice in high school. I barely got through speech class. The only reason I got through speech class is my mom was a teacher and happened to know them, and I got like a C- and C. But I actually failed most of the speeches because I couldn't get the words out in the right order. And I had no direction in what I was doing because I had never learned how to talk in front of people. That was weird, right? Eventually I got to my attitude. My attitude was one of the things, this was the hardest thing, because what happens is you have all these triggers. All these my mom would call right before I was walking out the door, and we'd have a conversation about nothing that had to do with what I was doing. All of a sudden it set me right back in that mentality, and I would walk out the door and I would go ruin what I was going to do. Or I'd have a conversation with somebody from the past or something I did. I mean, it was just the weirdest things. And I started having to tailor who I talk to and when I talk to people. So with that, I'm going to turn this back on real quick. I think I have to log back in.
Do you need help, Jeff?
Maybe.
Hold on.
Did it just shut off completely? What happened?
Hold on. I got you.
I got you.
It's my computer, so he doesn't know how to use it.
Does it shut off entirely?
Yeah, it does that. Hold on.
Is it warm in here? Because we might have to turn that up. 'Cause I'm warm, but I don't know if that's because
No,
I'm
I think it's comfortable.
I think I'm comfortable.
Okay. Is anybody? Okay. If you guys are good, you
No,
guys are
you're
good.
just getting
Look
fired
at
up.
this guy, man. You
Hey.
flew. I thought you were coming tomorrow.
Making it today.
Making it today. You didn't break any laws getting here, did you?
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe a
Good.
couple. Maybe a couple.
Welcome, Rich.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
He's in the groove. Now it's gonna get good.
Yeah,
Next
he
level
should.
frequency.
I said that too, yeah.
It's like,
Um,
he's in the zone,
I'm
you
gonna-
know?
I'm gonna-
Spent my
shut it
whole
off real
life trying to
quick.
get in the zone.
Shut it off and then turn it back on. 'Cause